Remember that build I made that allowed me to summon a bunch of Odyssey-class ships to fight alongside me? I've updated it, and now it can summon even more Odyssey-class ships. Welcome back to my favorite ship, the Lexington Dreadnought Cruiser. You know, until they finally make a flight deck carrier version of the Odyssey-class with a 5-3 weapons layout. Come on, Cryptic, don't make me beg, because I've already been doing that a lot. So, if you're new to this build, or to this channel in general, here's a little refresher. The Odyssey-class is my favorite ship in Star Trek, and I wanted to make a build that would allow me to summon even more Odyssey-class ships. At its base, it is a broadside fire-at-will build, though you could easily change that to beam overload if you prefer. But most of the traits and consoles are used to prioritize the ability to summon in additional ships that look like an Odyssey-class or one of its variants. Now, you'd probably think that there isn't a lot of stuff that allows you to do that sort of thing in the game, and when I first made this build, you were right, there really wasn't that much, but that was 7 months ago. We'll start with the weapons and core gear, because that really hasn't changed all that much since the original build. I'm still using my same phaser broadside build for the weapon setup, so that's the Terran Task Force phaser beam array, the 2 narrow-angle phaser beam arrays off that ship that I really hate, the Constitution 3, though if you don't have that ship and thus these weapons, you can easily just trade these for normal beam arrays. The wide-angle quantum torpedo, because you kind of need a torpedo to get ETM to work, and since it's a broadside build, a wide-angle torpedo is going to make things a bit easier. I'm still using the Trilithium Omni in the back, and honestly that's really just more for theme than anything else. I like the ship to kind of have a somewhat canon appearance, and that means phasers. However, if I was being smart about this, I would have gone with the Pavo Omni, because the Resonance Charge ability off of that thing is very powerful. Oh, and someone brought this up in the comments in the Typhon video. Yes, the Pavin Energy Torpedo is also a wide-angle torpedo because it does have a 180-degree arc, but it also has a 12-second recharge time, which is kind of brutal. And it actually makes it unusable for a fire-at-will build like this because 12 seconds is too long to keep ETM triggering consistently. A torpedo with a 10-second cooldown is the bare minimum to keep ETM running, and even then, that's kind of pushing it. 8 seconds is much safer. Of course, this wouldn't be a problem if Cryptic would actually give us a proper firing mode extender for fire-at-will. And I swear, if one of you brings up redirecting erase is crap! I shouldn't have to get shot at just to extend fire at will. It means that trait is only usable on a tank build, which this is not. Anyway, moving on. The last 3 weapons of the build are 3 phaser beam arrays. I'm using Agony Phaser just because they're the ones I have upgraded. You can use any flavor you like. Honestly, you don't even have to use phaser if you don't want to. You can use any damage type you want. It's not going to make a huge difference for this build. And in the core gear is my usual Elite Fleet Intervention Protomatter Deflector Array from the Fleet Colony for the extra crit chance and crit severity, the Prevailing Innervated Impulse Engine from the Competitive Reputation for the extra speed buff. Now, in the last video, I actually used the Warp Core from the Spire, but I've swapped that out for the Mycelia Harmonic Warp Core to get the 2-piece with the Discovery Shield. But honestly, you can go with the older Plasma Integrated Warp Core if you prefer from the Spire, or you could go with the Tholian Warp Core and get some extra damage with the Warp Crystals. Either way, I would still stick with the Discovery Reputation Shield. The devices are also unchanged from the original version of the build. The only one that is absolutely necessary to have for the theme of this build is the Flagship Distress Frequency Transponder, because that is the device that allows you to summon in an Odyssey-class ship when using fleet support. The consoles are where the biggest changes happen between the last version of the build and the current version. I'm using a lot more universal consoles this time around, and that's because a lot of these have the ability to summon in either a ship that looks like my ship, or one that looks very similar to it, or one that just straight up summons some variant of the Odyssey class. First off, you can still see I'm using ISOMAGs to buff my phaser power on the build, though I have cut that back to 5 ISOMAGs instead of the original 8. Among the universal consoles I'm now using, first is Subspace Fracture Tunneling Field. This was released on the Tier 6 Obelisk from the recent summer event, and I'm using this to help lower the cooldowns of my other Universal consoles. Several of these other Universal consoles are able to do exactly what this build was meant to do, summon in additional Odyssey-class ships, so by lowering those cooldowns even more, that means I can use them that much more often, which means that many more Odyssey-class ships. The next console is Fleet Power Network Array off of the Awani Command Carrier. Not only is this console able to provide significant buffs to energy weapon haste to your own ship, but it is also able to share those buffs with nearby pets. That includes summon pets, so you'll be buffing yourself and any Odysseys nearby. Or whatever other friendly pets might be near you, because, I've also got a hangar bay on here, as well as a couple of other consoles that summon in something else other than an Odyssey. Next up is Experimental Power Redirection off of the Excelsior 2. Now, honestly, this console is not necessary to the build at all. I just put this here for the sake of my own fun, because I really like this console, because it fires beams in every direction, and that is exactly the kind of gameplay I enjoy. But the Excelsior 2 is a lockbox ship, and thus very expensive, so don't feel like you have to get this console for the sake of this build. It's just there because I like it. You could easily swap this thing for literally anything else you want. The rest of these are all summoning consoles, the first of which is the Gemini device off of the Premonition. You know, that temporal science spearhead that should have been a temporal battlecruiser. Yes, I'm still on about this. Anyway, what this does is summon in an NPC version of the Enterprise F, and then it fires off a little Gemini effect projectile, and that projectile then splits the Enterprise F into 2 Enterprise Fs. They stick around for a while, fight alongside you, and then they disappear, and then you can just summon them again when it's off cooldown. Additionally, when you activate this console, your energy weapons get a 20% firing cycle haste buff for 30 seconds, which is actually pretty nice. Next up is the enhanced Mannheim device off of the Klein Temporal Destroyer. When activating this console, not only do you get a damage resistance rating buff for 30 seconds, but it also creates a past and a future quantum duplicate of your ship. So there are 2 additional ships that will look exactly like your ship. I should have mentioned this console in the video for the previous version of this build, but I just forgot it exists because I'm an idiot sometimes. But even then, I didn't own the console at the time anyway, so it didn't really matter all that much in the end. But I have it now, and that means I can get 2 additional Odysseys to this build. Next up is the Sensor Phantom Projector off of the Cyclone Intel Patrol Escort. What this does is create a Sensor Phantom, which will then taunt and draw enemy ships toward it, drawing their attention away from you. It also gives some nice buffs for directed energy weapon damage, so this one's already really nice to have for an energy weapon build. But the main reason it's here is because the Sensor Phantom will look exactly like your ship, so technically this is another Odyssey. The next console is Temporal Disorder, and this is actually the prize out of the current A Good Day to Die TFO event that is currently running on PC. Console, this should be starting for you guys in around a month. I really wanted to get my hands on this console purely for the sake of this build, and I got a little impatient and ended up buying it out halfway through. What it does is summon in 4 temporal duplicates of your ship that'll stick around for 60 seconds. Duplicates will fight alongside you and taunt nearby foes. Upon their death or the completion of that 60 seconds, they will explode in a 5-kilometer sphere of radiation damage that will also hold enemies for 10 seconds. And when that happens, you get a buff to speed and turn rate for 15 seconds. Additionally, the console also has a passive ability that if your hull drops below 50%, you will gain immunity to all damage for 3 seconds, which can trigger once every 60 seconds. While the clickability on this console is really cool, it does have a downside, and that's that its cooldown is a bit longer than most consoles. This one having a cooldown of 2 minutes and 30 seconds as opposed to the standard 2 minutes that most Universal consoles have. An extra 30 seconds might not sound like a lot, but it can add up. So that means subspace fracture tunneling field and unconventional systems are going to be that much more important for this console in particular. Though it's not like cooldown reduction wasn't already important, so you're kind of just continuing on as usual. Now, these last 2 don't actually summon Odyssey-class ships, but they do summon other ships, so whether or not they fit into the theme is kind of debatable, but because they do summon in additional ships, I felt like it was close enough to include them. At least until we can get more consoles that summon in actual Odysseys. The first is the Elite Alliance Squadron Beacon off of the Rex Pilot Escort. A number of people had previously suggested I put this console onto the build because, its effect of being able to summon in 4 additional ships. And I kind of resisted that for a while because it doesn't summon in Odyssey classes, and in fact 3 of the ships it summons aren't even Federation ships. But more than that, this console is also tied into the Wingman mechanic, and I felt like using this console on a ship that doesn't have the Wingman mechanic, I felt like I just wasn't getting the most out of it that I could be, so why use it at all? God, if we can get a playable Odyssey that has the Wingman mechanic, I would be such a happy person, because I love the Wingman mechanic, but I hate that it is restricted to Jem'Hadar ships. But yeah, it's 4 additional ships that I'm able to summon in for the build, so eventually I caved. Not using it on those grounds seemed kind of silly in the end, especially because I was already using Anthem Prime Fleet Museum Beacon, and that one only summons in 1 ship, and none of them are even an Odyssey class, so if I wasn't hung up about using that one, why should I be hung up about using this one? Originally I was using Valkyrie squadrons in the hangar bay, but since then I have swapped over to the Type 7 shuttles, which were released with the Awani command carrier. These things are really great for the insane amount of debuff that they're able to put out with Attack Pattern Beta and Close-In Sensor Pass, both of which reduce enemy damage resistance, so not only am I doing more damage, but also all of my pets are doing more damage, and any teammates also in the TFO are also doing more damage. But yeah, you can stick to the Valkyries or any other pets you might want, but honestly, these are going to be best in slot for this build. Unless they release another pet that somehow has even more debuff than these things. My specializations are still the same, Intel Primary, Temporal Secondary. The personal space traits are still mostly the same from the last version of the build, though I did make one change. I am still using Friends in Unusual Places for the sake of lowering the cooldown of fleet support. That is still a very important part of this build, because since I'm using the flagship Distress Frequency Transponder, fleet support summons in an Odyssey class. But in the video for the previous version of this build, someone recommended that I add advanced rapid support for kind of the same reason. This personal trait significantly lowers the cooldown of career-specific abilities. Now, I'm already using It's Another Enterprise in the Starship traits because that will summon in a flagship every time I use Engineering Tactical or Science Fleet. So Advanced Rapid Support makes sense to use because if I can lower the cooldown of Engineering Team, that means that I can trigger It's Another Enterprise that much more. Friends in Unusual Places can drop from the Infinity Lockboxes or can be purchased from the Exchange. Advanced Rapid Support is rewarded through the Temporal Recruitment event. In the Starship traits, I have made a few changes from the previous version of the build, but I will go over each one. This is a Fire at Will build, so obviously I need a way to extend Fire at Will some way, and in 20 Tactical Matrices is as close as I'm going to get to that. Remember what I said about redirecting arrays. But seriously, Cryptic, Fire at Will needs a proper extension trait. This thing is just obnoxious. You know, I can't use Maelstrom torpedoes with entwined tactical matrices, and that's really annoying. Moving on, the rest of these are more focused to the theme of the build, the first being Superior Command Frequency. Now, this one can be a little difficult to track down because there are actually 3 different versions of this trait. There's Command Frequency and then Improved Command Frequency, both of which are unlocked by progressing through the Command Specialization. And the superior version can be unlocked as a reward from the Temporal Recruitment event. The most important part of this trait is that it removes the low health restrictions to fleet support. All 3 versions of the trait will do that. Additionally, it also lowers the cooldown of fleet support. The basic version will lower it by 5 minutes, and the improved version will lower it by 10. And if you get the superior version of Command Frequency, that will add a frigate to the list of ships that are summoned with fleet support. Remember, because this build is using the flagship Distress Beacon, using fleet support will summon in an Odyssey-class, so lowering its cooldowns and removing its restrictions are very important to the theme of this build, which is summon in as many Odyssey-class ships as you can. The nice thing about the Odyssey-class ships summoned in with fleet support is that they don't have any sort of cooldown on them as long as you remain in combat. They will stay with you for as long as you are in combat until they're destroyed. If you ever drop out of combat, they'll stick around for like 30 seconds, but if you don't get back into combat before that, then they will just warp away. There aren't a lot of TFOs where you can stay in combat that regularly, but those you can rack up a good number of Odyssey pets following you around. The next trait is Black Alert off of the Crossfield Science Spearhead. Now, I have a bit of an issue with this Starship trait, and that issue is that its damage output is complete trash. I mean, complete and utter trash. It is so rare to see anything do less damage than Black Alert. This trait is bad, and it should feel bad for how absolutely terrible its DPS output is. But with this trait, I can summon in Spore duplicates of my ship, which will then fire off a small little torpedo spread, which does almost no damage at all. But it is more Odysseys on the field, even if they only show up for a couple seconds at a time. And then have a 25-second lockout period. This trait has terrible performance, and I really hate it for that, but it is thematically appropriate, so it stays there for now. At least until the end of the video, in which case I'll probably put Emergency Weapon Cycle back on. But I knew if I didn't include this trait, a bunch of you would take the opportunity to jump down my throat for not including Black Alert, despite how many times I have repeatedly said that this trait is utter garbage. I really need more Starship traits that summon in other Odyssey-class ships, purely for the sake of me not having to use Black Alert anymore. Anyway, the next Starship trait is It's Another Enterprise, which I kinda went over already. Whenever I use Engineering, Tactical, or Science Fleet, I summon in a flagship. And it's why I'm using Advanced Rapid Support. This trait is available from the Titan Science Destroyer. Next is Photonic Diversion off of the Cardassian Damar Intel Science Dreadnought. With this, anytime I activate Jam Targeting Sensors, which I'm already using as an unconventional systems trigger, or evade target lock, this will deploy a photonic decoy at my target's location. The decoy will attack your target with spiral wave disruptors and photon torpedoes and have a constant feedback pulse effect. The decoy sticks around for 20 seconds and can only be triggered once every 30 seconds. And the whole reason this is here is because that decoy will look exactly like your own ship, so that is another Odyssey. Now, in the original version of this build, I was using the trait Heard I Need Help, but ultimately I decided to trade it out because, one, it's really hard to trigger because it requires your hull to be at 50% or lower, and it has a cooldown timer of 2 minutes, which is a long time. Instead, I am using these traits, which technically don't adhere to the theme of the build because they don't summon in an Odyssey class, but I do feel like they are worthwhile. The first is Repurposed Cargo Bay Hangar off of the Typhon. With this, anytime I launch a Hangar Bay pet, this will also launch its own squadron of Advanced Federation Valkyrie fighters. Maxing out at 6 squadrons, this thing is effectively a second Hangar Bay for this ship. Now, for a while, I was actually using Formation Flying off of the Deimos Pilot Destroyer. With that, it adds a pair of synth destroyers to the list of ships that you can summon with fleet support. But when the Typhon came out, I quickly replaced that with its trait, because not only is it more pets I'm able to summon onto the build, but they also do more damage than the Sith Destroyers too. So it was kind of a win-win. Though, of course, this starship trait does require a hangar bay in order to function, so if you are using this build on a version of the Odyssey that does not have a hangar bay, then that's kind of pointless. The last starship trait is Cooperation is the Dominant Strategy off of the Friendship Command flight deck carrier. This is here for buffing my pets, both my hangar pets and my non-hangar pets, those being the summon pets, the Odysseys. Anytime I use a Bridge Officer ability or Universal Console ability that affects an ally, that ally will get a bonus damage buff. Hangar pets get 20%, non-hangar pets get 10%. These buffs will last 30 seconds and can stack up to 5 times. Now, originally, the only thing I had triggering this effect was Fleet Power Network Array, but I've just realized something while recording this. Remember that trick on the Typhon that I showed you guys using Needs of the Many? It applied a healing effect to friendly targets nearby without having to actually specifically target them. So I could just spam Needs of the Many and my pets would get the Friendship is Science buff. Now, obviously I can't do that here on the Lexington because I don't have any command seating, but I've also confirmed that I can get a very similar effect out of aligned shield frequencies. Though there is a downside to this alternative, and that is the range. Needs of the Many has a range of 15 kilometers, so you can buff a good amount of pets just by being kinda nearby, whereas Aligned Shield Frequencies only has a range of 4 kilometers. So you're going to have to be a lot closer to your pets in order to give them the Friendship is Science buff using Aligned Shield Frequencies. So it wouldn't be quite as effective, but it would still work. So honestly, I should probably swap out Emergency Powered Engines for that. And you know, that trick with Needs of the Many also worked with flagship staffing, so maybe I could add this to the build too. Which could give me another excuse to get rid of Black Alert, because Black Alert is terrible. Anyway, moving on to the Bridge Officer seating. See, this whole left side over here, all of these are here for unconventional systems triggers. So that's Jam Targeting Sensors, Scramble Sensors, Gravity Well 1, and Tractor Beam 1. All of those are science abilities. Oh, actually, in this case, Jam Targeting Sensors is also being used to trigger Photonic Decoy. And in the Intel abilities, Viral Impulse Burst and Ionic Turbulence. Ionic Turbulence is also pretty nice for its damage resistance debuff. The Intel abilities are also triggering Black Alert, but we know how I feel about that one already. In the tactical seat, I've got Fire at Will 3 because this is a Fire at Will build. You could swap this with Beam Overload if you wanted instead, but remember you'd also have to swap out the Starship trait, so instead of Entwined Tactical Matrices, you would want Super Weapon Ingenuity off of the Xindi Adolith Dreadnought. In the Lieutenant spot, I've got the Chemosite Lace Weaponry 2 for some extra radiation damage to my weapons fired, though you could swap this out for Attack Pattern Beta for the debuff instead. It's really up to you. Attack Pattern Beta would be a lot cheaper to get. And of course, Torpedo Spread 1 for the sake of buffing my torpedo and for triggering Entwined Tactical Matrices. I love Fire at Will, it is definitely my preferred playstyle, but I am so sick of having to use Entwined Tactical Matrices. Anyway, moving on to the Commander Engineering / Miracle Worker seat. First I have Emergency Powered Engines 1, which I've already said I'm probably going to swap out for Aligned Shield Frequencies 1 for the sake of being able to trigger Cooperation as the Dominant Strategy better. Of course, if you don't have that trait, then you could probably just keep Emergency Powered Engines there. And you could pair that with the Emergency Con Hologram and use that to lower the cooldown of your evasive maneuvers. Then I've got Emergency Powered Weapons 2 for the sake of giving the bonus damage buff to my energy weapons and giving some extra weapon power. Narrow Sensor Bands 3, which also gives bonus damage to my energy weapons and is like 90% of the reason why I like Miracle Worker. And the other 10% is Mixed Armament Synergy, which can give bonus damage buffs to the weapons that you are not firing at the time. Basically, if you activate this and then fire a torpedo, your energy weapons will get a buff, and vice versa. Now, there aren't really any duty officers that help with the theme of this ship. There aren't any that summon in other ships or lower the cooldowns of any of the abilities that do summon in other ships. So this is just kind of my usual duty officer setup. Use whatever works best for you. Now, normally this is where I would show you to a demonstration of like an ISE with this build, or maybe a patrol like Ninth Rule or Jupiter Gauntlet. In fact, last time I did use Ninth Rule, but with this one I'm going to show you something a little different. Defense of Starbase 1, and by extension Resistance of Starbase 1, are both fairly long TFOs that you remain mostly in combat throughout the whole time. And it's a really good demonstration to show off why I really like this build. So I'm going to show you that instead, that'll show you some combat logs. So yeah, Resistance of Starbase 1 really demonstrates just how many ships I can summon in with just this one build. And that is something that amuses me to no end, just being able to summon in this massive fleet of ships that are just floating around, kind of helping with combat. They don't necessarily even have to be, like, doing a crap ton of damage. It's just funny to see them out there doing their thing. Now, in that Resistance of Starbase 1, I did just under 200k, which doesn't sound that impressive in the grand scheme of, like, all my other builds, but keep in mind, Resistance of Starbase 1 is not a DPS map, so it's not going to be a really great gauge to show you what this thing can do. Fortunately, I did test this in 9th role, and in that I was able to do over 300k, which is honestly kind of surprising because I don't think the original build ever broke 250. Honestly, I expected this version of the build to do less damage than the original, because I mean, I'm using fewer ISO mags, and I took off the protomatter infusers. I'm not using the Hydra, I'm not using sensor suspension burst. I even took off the DPRM. But I think the reason why this one is doing more powerful is because not only am I able to summon more pets, I'm able to more effectively buff said pets. Largely thanks to Fleet Power Network Array, and cooperation is the dominant strategy. The Subspace Fracture Tunneling field is also undoubtedly making a huge difference because of how much it is able to reduce the cooldowns of my Universal consoles. So not only am I able to trigger those summoning consoles more often, but I'm also able to buff them more often with the Fleet Power Network Array. So yeah, that is the update to my Odyssey Summoner build. Now with more Odysseys, just how I like it, though it's still not enough. Let me know what you guys thought of the update down below in the comments, and while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications. If you would like to further support the channel, you can hit that join button to become a member, or you can check out the merch store, or if you're ever shopping on the Epic Game Store, be sure to use my content creator code STU1701. It really helps me out, and I really do appreciate it. Either way though, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.